So, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to the Institute of Peace. My name is Bill Taylor. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Institute. Most of you have been here before, some of you many times, but let me just remind those of you who are first time that while we've been in this building since 2011, we've been working, looking to ways to solve conflicts around the world since 1984. And so this is what we do. We focus on conflict. And today, we're focusing on conflict, war by other means. This is a great opportunity for us, in particular with Anne Applebaum. No one has thought longer or harder about this issue. I think this is fair to say. She's been thinking about this for a long time, writing about it for a long time. Started writing her book, which I highly recommend, Red Famine on Stalin's War on Ukraine. She started writing this in 2010, but only when it was not a main topic, let's say. Now it is. Now it's a very topical. This book just came out last year. Anne has written for many publications, including yesterday on the opinion page of the Washington Post, and we'll get to this article in a minute, Anne, I suspect, on these topics. Pulitzer Prize winner for previous books. Also now at the London School of Economics, and she's done some thinking about this topic at the London School of Economics and runs a program there on disinformation. We are very pleased to have you and Anne will start off with a couple of remarks about the work she's been doing, how to think about this kind of a problem. That will probably suggest a couple of questions that I will pose. I will be very interested to turn it over to you to ask her questions that are on your mind on this topic. So, Anne. Welcome.
Right, so thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation. It's nice to be back at this great institution again. I should say my book about Ukraine is about a much earlier version of Russian disinformation. It's about the 1920s and 1930s.
It is.
And you will find parallels to the present, some of which I lay out in the book, and particularly the last part of the book.
Right at the end, you'll notice these parallels, right?
Right. But so what I'm going to talk about today is not that, although if you want to ask me questions about the Ukrainian famine in 1932-33, I'm really more than delighted to talk about it. So this topic of Russian disinformation, I've been around Washington before speaking about it at different times, and almost each time I do it, there's a greater understanding. I think when I would first bring this up 3 or 4 years ago, people would look at me a little oddly and say, well, that kind of thing, maybe that's important for Poland, but really why? I'm not sure why it's of interest to us. And I think we all now, after having watched both the Russian reaction to the change, to the follow-up to the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and then Russian involvement in a series of elections, including our own, people feel a little bit differently about it now. I really have a lot to say about this issue. I run a small program now in London, which does some research around it. I can talk a little bit about that if you want more specifically, different kinds of research. So I'll just offer at the beginning just a few different ways to think about both what it is and what we can do about it. First of all, I think it's important to understand that it's part of a larger ecosystem. These really are is political influence operations, and because this is the U.S. Institute of Peace, I think it's important to say some of them are also connected to current or future military operations. As an example, I met with some people last week who work in the Baltic states and who were talking about Russian work with these kind of paramilitary organizations in Latvia and Estonia. These are paintball groups or airsoft groups, or they're places where young people can meet and shoot at targets. And the use that these have been, I've written a column about this in the past, and the use of those as a way to, and some of them now use FSB insignia on their uniforms. So this is a way in which the Russians are seeking to create friends and allies in Latvia. And the point of it was, as they said to me, one of them said to me was, well, the way we understand this is that this is simply the Russians creating options for themselves. It doesn't mean they're going to invade Latvia next week. It doesn't mean they may ever invade Latvia, but just in case the possibility came through, they're doing an advance recruitment and information campaign around, in Latvia to prepare that. I think that's one of the ways in which to think about what the purpose of this is. But it's part of a larger ecosystem. It's connected to cyber hacking and cybersecurity. It's connected to economic, search for economic influence, political influence buying, as well as legitimate political influence and diplomacy and so on. So it's a piece of larger operations, and it's a piece of a larger strategy. The difficulty, and I should also say it's customized to particular countries. So Russian influence campaigns in Germany look a lot different from Russian influence campaigns in Latvia, which look, again, different from them in Bolivia and look different from South Africa. And they often have different pieces and different goals. In Europe, the strategy in general, and this is, you don't have to be screamingly original to say this, is Russia has a clear interest in breaking up NATO and in persuading the United States to leave Europe, as well as in breaking up the European Union and undermining it. This is for a variety of reasons of their own. The Russians see the European Union as a competitor, and even an ideological competitor. It's an organization that is interested in democracy, rule of law, freedom of speech. Whether or not you think it's good or bad, those are its stated goals. And these are ideas and values that the Russians see as threatening to them, and so they seek to. So it's not very hard to understand what the general strategy is. And of course, had I said this a year or two ago, it sounded ridiculous. How could the Russians possibly break up the European Union? More recently, you can begin to see how it could be done, by aligning themselves with far right and far left anti-European parties in each European country. And so in Greece, that might be the far left. In Germany, it might be the far right. In another country, it might be somebody else, and seeking to promote and amplify those narratives inside those countries. So you need to understand it as part of a bigger strategy and as one tactic among many. But it is the one tactic that we're not used to, and we were very unprepared for when it began to function. There are a lot of reasons why it's quite difficult to think about, and why difficult to respond to, partly because it breaks down the line between a domestic and a foreign issue for many countries. So if you are, the Swedish government, and you're thinking about Swedish elections in September, and you're thinking, well, you're worried about, your security services are worried about, the Russians attempting to amplify the language of the Swedish far right in your country. Well, what do you do about that? Because the Swedish far right is, other than the violent, we're not talking about violent extremisms. This is a legitimate part of Swedish politics. You're hardly going to ban it, just because it's pro-Russian. It's not illegal to be pro-Russian. It's not illegal to like some things the Russian government does. It's not, and so the line between what is foreign and what is domestic policy is particularly different for Europeans, and actually indeed for us to sort out, and that makes it difficult to think about and difficult to act against. It's also the motivations for people who participate in Russian disinformation campaigns are also very various. Some of them are financial. So we did a project looking specifically at the German elections and Russian involvement, and also international alt-right involvement in the German elections. We discovered, and I'll make a long story short, one of the things we discovered was it's a botnet based in Nizhny Novgorod that was promoting the German far right, the alternative for Deutschland. So what else was this botnet doing? It was promoting the AfD, the German far right. It was also promoting an escort service in Dubai. It was also, it was promoting some companies based in Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. So in other words, this was a multi-purpose organization that was created. Somebody was doing it for money. Somebody had paid them to work for, so understanding the motivations of these different actors can be difficult. So that's a financial one. We also discovered what were clearly volunteers. It looked like American and Swedish and other alt-right trolls who were voluntarily amplifying Russian narratives. so trying to understand who are they and what their motivations are. So there are different actors in this space and they have different motivations. You can't think of, it's not as if they're all, KGB agents. It's a much more complicated picture and a more complicated world, and it's more difficult to think about. And one of the conclusions that we came to is that fighting Russian influence in Germany is going to look a lot like fighting the extreme right. It's going to be a similar way of thinking. So that's just a few words about kind of what it is. How to think about pushing back against it. There is no silver bullet. I mean, sadly, there is no thing I can say, if only the US government would fund X, then we would fix the problem. I don't think it's going to work like that. I don't even think that some of the traditional ways in which we fought disinformation in the past, or we used to call it propaganda, will work quite as well now because the nature of the information world has changed. But we can think in some broad categories. We can talk about, fighting its influence in Europe. We can talk about defense. We can talk about empowering the people who are already doing this well, whether that's networks of fact checkers, networks of counter-extremists. Actually, counter-jihadists and counter-extremists are often the same people, and they act in very similar ways. Another piece of the defense is making sure that independent media exist. There are a lot of countries in which media has become almost a parody of itself. I mean, you get in smaller European countries, media is often very, very weak. It's been captured by one group of oligarchs or another group of oligarchs, and is very easily captured and pushed in one direction or another. And so finding ways of empowering independent media is part of the solution. There may also be, I'll be careful how I talk about this, but there may also be ways in which we should think about engaging Russian audiences. So Russian disinformation in Russia is every bit as loud and vociferous as it is in Europe, and in possibly, just as dangerous, even more dangerous. I just wrote a piece that I think you were holding that was in the Washington Post today? Yesterday.
Yep.
I don't know when my pieces are published, but pointing out that somebody's recently done a study of how Europe is portrayed in the Russian press. And it is, of course, overwhelmingly negative. Europe is falling apart. Europe is decadent. Europe is dying. And at the same time, Europe is aggressive. The Europeans are trying to, they're about to invade Russia. They aim to cause us trouble and difficulty. It is really important and by the way, I should say that although this was one would have to find a different study. They haven't. The same group who did that study is now doing one on the image of America in Russia. Believe me, it is equally toxic. The United States is our enemy. The United States is trying to destroy us. Don't rule out nuclear weapons because they're still part of the mix. Remember that we still have them. This will protect us against the dangerous United States. So this kind of language could also, one of the things that it could be used for is to lay the groundwork or to prepare Russians to accept greater Russian aggression in Europe as well. So we have a clear interest in finding ways of reaching Russian audiences and speaking directly to Russians if that's possible to do, and finding some new ways to do it, and we can talk about what that might be. I'll conclude by saying one of the things that happens to everybody I know who's worked on the question of Russian disinformation is pretty quickly, for historical reasons, the Russians were doing this first, and they were doing it more. They understood the flaws of the internet. They understood how to use anonymity and how to use the ease with which you can create fake websites and so on to multiply false news, as well as create false identities and false audiences. But the techniques are open to anybody. Some of them are created just by the nature of Facebook. You can use Facebook now to reach different kinds of targeted audiences. They could be used by the Chinese. They could be used by the Iranians. They could be used by people in Texas. I mean, it doesn't really, it's not, there's no particular reason why this should be a Russian specialty. And beginning to think in deeper ways about the structure of the internet. How do we responsibly manage anonymity? How do we end the proliferation of dark ads? How do we give people some kind of reliable, identifier, some way of verifying information or verifying videos, for example, online? Creating a watermark is one of the expressions that I've heard people use in Silicon Valley. So that, for example, when you see a picture of, whether it's President Obama or President Trump saying something, you know that as we get into the world of easily faked videos, which we're getting closer to, how can you identify that one's real or that's really him speaking? Is there some system we can create? So beginning to think about the structure of the internet itself, and this particular structure of social media, and how we prevent these campaigns at a much deeper level, I think also has to be part of the conversation. And that's really not, that's a conversation for Washington and Congress to have with the tech companies and with the public, and in which you don't even need to involve Russia at all. So I'll finish by saying that there are different ways of thinking about the problem. There are different kinds of solutions, and one of them may be, might involve our, American companies that have created these spectacular and amazing platforms, and finding ways to make sure that they don't discredit or undermine the internet altogether. I'll finish there.
And you're not finished there. We're going to continue this. Thank you. That's a great opening. There are a couple of things that I'd like to just pursue, and then I'd look to the people in this room. You said that this war by other means is a good topic for the Institute of Peace.
Yep.
And we're reminded, of course, by that war is the continuation of politics by other means.
Right.
And so if we work it backwards, if we're concerned, as we are, about conflict, violent conflict, and we go back to the hybrid warfare of which this information war is a piece, it's the politics then. There's a policy there, and you alluded to some of these things. The Russian government, maybe the Kremlin, maybe Mr. Putin has something in mind, and you mentioned a couple of those kind of things. To get you to elaborate on those. Break up NATO, break up the EU.
Occupy Eastern Ukraine.
Occupy Eastern Ukraine, which again goes back to your point here on the Red Famine, on Stalin's war on Ukraine. Stalin was real concerned about Ukraine as well. The concern that the Kremlin had in 2014 that Ukraine was going towards Europe triggered this thing. So, how do you describe? How do you think about the policy that extend into hybrid warfare and into war?
So 2014 is an interesting moment, because a lot of what whether it's both the overt propaganda and RT and Sputnik and all these kind of tools, as well as the covert influence buying and so on, had been going on in Europe for a while. I mean, for a decade. We saw plenty of it in Ukraine before. I saw it in Poland. I've seen it in lots of other places. It wasn't brand new at all in 2014, but it's true that in 2014 it was dialed up. In a way that it became much more visible to everybody else. I mean, I was kind of, as I said, I was banging on about the subject earlier. And people would kind of say, oh, well, that's very interesting, and it's very sad for Poland, but. 2014 is an interesting moment, because that's when you could see what how in a specific conflict situation it could be used. And so what happened, first of all, why did the Russians invade Crimea? And second of all, how was it done? And why is because what did the Russians see in 2014 at the moment of the Maidan revolution? Putin saw kind of his nightmare. There were young Ukrainians waving EU flags, saying we want an end to corruption and we want democracy and rule of law. I mean, this is exactly the kind of movement and the kind of demonstration that he worries most about at home. And this is exactly the whether you call it it wasn't a color revolution, whatever you call it, however you describe it, this kind of movement that links together people who want a different kind of political system, different to his own, which is kleptocratic and oligarchic rather than democratic, and is based on very profoundly cynical ideas about government. So what he feared most was this. So how does he undermine this? What was the language they used? If you remember, they started talking about Nazis. These are the enemies of Russia. These people, they claim to be wearing the EU flag, but actually this is a Nazi movement led by, and for those of you who don't know Ukrainian history, it's a Banderites, which means a Nazi-era Ukrainian independence movement. And he sought both inside Russia and outside Russia to portray this as a far-right fascist movement. And let's not get into the the details of it, but as we know, the Maidan was actually a very complicated, complex group of people. There were, gay and lesbian groups demonstrating. There were people from all walks of Ukrainian society. You could find Nazis if you wanted to find them, or anyway, not Nazis, but fascists. But the Kremlin idea was, this is how we're characterizing it, and they sought very hard to sell that both inside Russia, inside Ukraine, and inside Europe. And to some degree, they had some success. I mean, there were parts of the American left who bought this narrative. Stephen Cohen, writing in The Nation, wrote more or less this. And these are legitimate people. I mean, this is not a very legitimate writer and a legitimate magazine, so it's not like. That was one piece of it. It was an attempt to characterize this as an evil anti-Russian government, and both to make Russians not want to. Not be attracted by those people waving EU flags, and also to denigrate Ukraine and the ideas of the West. Second piece of disinformation we saw is that when the Russians finally began their invasion of Crimea, which was, what was the first thing that happened? They said there is no invasion of Crimea. This is now too famous a story for everybody in this room not to know, but these aren't real. They have nothing to do with Russia. They're just volunteers. They're just soldiers. They bought their weapons in a local store. I don't know where they got their armored personnel carriers. Can't you just buy that at the local Safeway? It sounds now ridiculous in retrospect, because after a few weeks it became clear what it was, and actually now Putin has given medals to the people who led that invasion and so on. But I actually remember quite well the first 2 or 3 days, people were confused, and people said, what is this? Is this separatists? Are these Ukrainians? Are they Russians? What is it? And there was a moment of international paralysis, which was quite key for the occupation of Crimea to take place and happen. So it actually was a very, very successful information operation, as ridiculous as it seems in retrospect. So, these are just 2 examples of how you can use language, and you can use media to, in order to shape how people perceive a conflict, to perceive their willingness or otherwise to intervene in it, to stop it, to negotiate it, or to participate in it. And of course, in Ukraine, there was an effort to inspire Russian-speaking Ukrainians to fight the new government after the old president of Ukraine fled the country. And this is an interesting example where I think Putin's strategy was quite weak, because I think what he thought would happen was that Russian-speaking Ukrainians were Russians, and that therefore they would rise up against what was perceived to be a nationalist government in Kiev, and they would defeat it. And actually, Russian-speaking Ukrainians are Ukrainians, or at least some of them are, or they feel themselves to be, or anyway, they did not see themselves as wanting to be part of Putin's Russia. And certainly not to be run by, gangs of, mercenaries controlled by the FSB in some unclear way, which is how those kind of rogue provinces in eastern Ukraine are now governed. And so that disinformation campaign failed, but it was certainly they put a lot of effort into it. They continued to push those lines in eastern Ukraine. I mean, in a way, Ukraine is a kind of petri dish for a lot of these issues, both for the Russians experimenting with different ways to shape the political conversation, and Ukrainians experimenting with different ways to fight back against it, which is a whole other interesting stuff. It's not an accident that one of the first organizations conceived as an anti-fake news or anti-disinformation NGO is the group called Stop Fake, which was created in Kiev precisely for this reason at that moment, because the Ukrainians saw, exactly how this worked and how, there was literally fake photographs, fake video, fake stories were being used to tell and give an incorrect version of what happens in Ukraine. But so yes, Ukraine is an important place to look, both because, as I said, that's where it was dialed up in a way that was most visible to us for the first time, and also I think it's I don't think we're at the end of this story in Ukraine or anywhere else by now. I mean, there's an ongoing. I should also. But the Ukraine is also useful because you can then understand how this issue connects to others. It can connect to kinetic military operations, to economic operations, to cyber operations, to hacking operations. I mean, the idea of hacking someone's email and then using it or taping them a conversation and then using that sort of private material and turning into 1,000 different conspiracy theories and then kind of blasting them all over social media. This has been done now about 10 times. This is not a new idea. It's been done lots of times. The Russians figured it out sort of earlier than other people, but that doesn't mean lots of other people won't do it. So, the fact that we saw that in our election doesn't mean it was invented here.
Yep. Sticking for a moment with the purpose, with the policy that this is an extension. You, in your article yesterday, in the Post, could be a more sinister purpose. You've suggested that they would be doing this. One reason they may be doing it is because they have something else in mind. It may be diplomatic, it may be economic, it may be military. Without being alarmist, you had said that this is maybe something you would...
So, as I said, have I said this already? I mean, as I would characterize this as the Russians creating options for themselves. Yeah. Okay, so the fact that they're, portraying Europe as simultaneously weak and degenerate and falling apart, and also very aggressive and anti-Russian, could be useful in all kinds of ways. But among other things, it could be useful if there was ever a war with Europe. I mean, if you're fighting against a weak and degenerate and aggressive place, then you would have motivation to fight against them. So in the case that there would be some kind of conflict, which I'm not saying is being planned or is going to happen tomorrow or is being executed, or if the opportunity arose to, whether in Estonia and Latvia or whether somewhere else, or in the Balkans or somewhere in, along some fault line in Ukraine, to fight, that, having prepared the ground this way might prove to be very useful. So watching the Russian narratives and understanding what's being said, and this is the argument about what they're saying inside Russia, this has nothing to do with us, I think is very important for people who are interested in conflict prevention, because these are the kinds of narratives you would use, and this is the kind of propaganda you would conduct if you were considering that there might be a conflict at some point in the future.
Yep. That conflict prevention is a big part of this building's work.
I know. That's why I'm here.
And thank you for being here. Okay, let me give you an opportunity to ask and questions. When you do, please just raise your hand. I will call on you. I think we will have a couple of people with mics that are moving in the back. And if you'll stand and state your name and then fire away. So who will go first here? Yes, sir, right here. There we go.
Yeah, hey, Dan Ornato from the National Democratic Institute. So I'm working in different contexts internationally on this problem, and specifically collaborating with local groups who are attempting to do fact-checking and media literacy and other programs. I'm curious, from your perspective, if you've found other examples of Russian influence campaigns outside of the former Soviet Union and Europe, and what you are expecting for 2018 in terms of potential influence campaigns. I'm thinking particularly of Mexico as a potential opportunity, but even Brazil is a major election coming up and has repercussions certainly in the region. But I'm curious if you have other examples in mind in terms of ways Russia is attempting to project their influence outside of traditional spheres.
Right. So that's a great question. I mean, you probably know the fact that you asked the question leads me to believe you probably know the answer better than me. Intervening in an election, and by the way, I should just, as a kind of parentheses, It's easiest to talk about elections because those are the most spectacular moments, when power changes in a democracy and when you can influence who gets to win. But a lot of these influence campaigns are very long-term. For example, the campaign to persuade, the German nation that NATO is a bad idea has been ongoing for a long time and will continue whether or not there are elections or not elections. So it's a little bit of a mistake to just look at elections, although I understand why people do it because it's the most spectacular. The second thing I will say is that all of this stuff, is technologically speaking, by comparison to cyber hacking or other forms of, or cyber, is technologically very easy. You don't actually have to be in Mexico in order to mess around with the Mexican internet. This is one of the most amazing things about global media and global information systems. All you need is a few people who understand Mexican politics, and you don't even need maybe even that many. And you need a few people who have the time to get involved in it. And this is just the online piece of it. There could also be political influence buying, which requires a bit more money, or there could be economic influence. So I would not count Russian, or indeed Chinese or other influence, covert, disinformation campaigns out of any election. I have not personally worked on Mexico, but I am told there is that lots and lots of people are involved in trying to swing the Mexican elections one way or the other, including narco groups, including Russians, including maybe others. So, I would say that I am aware of that. I'm certainly aware that they're interested in other Latin American countries. I've also heard Colombia mentioned. I was in South Africa a year or two ago and was told about Russian influence buying there, as well as there's a big Russian power investment there as well. And so that may be another place where they're, in those kinds of countries, my guess is their interests are economic more than political. Although of course they're connected. If you want a big power plant or nuclear power deal, then it helps to have the right people, in the government. Whereas in Europe, I think they do have a big, they have a big and pretty clear strategy that involves undermining the current security order. And I don't know if that's this. I wouldn't say that that's the same all over the, in other places, but. Certainly Latin America, certainly resource-rich bits of Africa. I think the Chinese probably have a lot more invested in Asia. But I wouldn't discount anything. Again, it's very easy. It's relatively very cheap. It's not very high tech. Why wouldn't you do it?
What would be the goal of that in Latin America?
Putting someone, in charge of a country who is going to be friendly to Russian economic interests. Yeah. Or alternatively, again, Latin Americanists in the room are going to know more than me, putting someone in charge of a country who is, anti-American interests. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine in Mexico and Brazil and lots of other places where that would make sense.
Sure. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Wilson with Rutgers Law School. I am aware of a study that was done by the Oxford Computational Propaganda Program that was showing that, fake news, they called it junk news in that report.
Everybody hates the expression fake news, so.
Is mainly a problem on the far right. And the far right media in this country responded, well, this is not disinformation. This is conservative, mainstream, far right-wing media. This is our media. It's not disinformation. So it seems to me there's also disinformation that is indigenous disinformation.
Sure.
And that this requires a different kind of strategy for dealing with it. I'm just wondering what your opinion and thoughts are.
So this is where you get to the difficulty of defining the problem. The line that we're used to thinking of between what is a domestic policy issue and what is a foreign policy issue has become blurred. The nature of information now is that it's global and anybody can intervene in it. And you can be sitting in Moscow and you can participate, with gusto in the Mexican election campaign. So this is a new, it's a change in the way we're used to thinking about these kinds of problems. And this is one of the reasons, I think, why we've stumbled so hard in trying to figure out what to do about it, for exactly the reason that you just suggested. I happen to know, the Swedish government is very interested in thinking about Russian intervention in their elections, which are in September. But, if what that's going to look like is a Russian attempt to amplify legitimate Swedish political parties, then what is the Swedish government going to do about it? I mean, nothing. How can they do anything about it? It's not in the security services remit to block legitimate politics. Or, as you say, you can find far-right narratives in lots of places that have nothing to do with Russia. I mean, maybe the best example of that is Marine Le Pen's party in France. So the National Front has been around in France, for many decades. It has a direct lineage back to Vichy. It's been part of French politics for a long time. Marine Le Pen's father was involved in French politics for many decades. She herself has legitimate followers in France, and has been a political actor in France all of her life. The fact that her party is now funded by Putin and, openly, and there's no secret about that, its election campaign was funded by loans from these kind of Russian Czech banks. During the middle of the French election campaign, she actually went to Moscow and met with Putin. During the campaign, there's no secret about that. There's nobody's denying these links. The fact that there was a Russian trolling operation during the French campaign that was meant to help. So all of this is a difficult problem for the French to think about. I mean, there is no question that Marine Le Pen is a legitimate French political force, and nobody could deny that. And that is why paying attention, understanding what is it that Russian influence is doing? It's seeking to amplify those voices whom they prefer. And there are going to be people who say this is legitimate. Why not? That's just part of life, and it's just a little bit easier now than it used to be. And then there's a second set of answers that are, do we think foreign? Should we look at advertising? Should we look at foreign funding? Should there be? Are there ways of changing the electoral system or the electoral regulation to block that? I would say in almost every country, you need to look specifically at what's happening. The tactics are customized to each place, and there's some places where you could see how changing electoral laws could fix the problem, and in other places you need to think much more broadly about narratives. But I'll return to something I said before. Fighting Russian influence, so-called Russian influence in Europe, is going to look a lot like, in a lot of places, like fighting the extreme right. And different countries have different views about the extreme right. I mean, in Germany, it's illegal, so it's not that hard to think about how you would fight it. In Britain, not so clear. They have different kinds of hate speech laws, and in this country we don't have hate speech laws at all, or we have a much different attitude towards freedom of speech. So each country is going to have to come up with a different set of. I can't give you a single answer that will explain what you do everywhere, because these are answers that have to do with the nature of a particular given country and its political system. It's a good question. There isn't a single answer. There are multiple answers.
Sir.
My name is Karwan Zabari. Let me shift to Syria. A two-part question. One, President Putin was just sworn in today for another 4 years. Can you give us what the outlook looks like? Do we expect the status quo to continue? Do we expect the more aggressive Putin in Russia?
I'll just get out my crystal ball, which is back here.
And then second, simply put, what's in it for Russia to do what it's doing in Syria?
So I can't. I mean, I don't like doing predictions. I have no reason to think that anything in particular is going to change in Russia. I don't have any. On the contrary, Putin seems to have been reinforced and so on. I mean, having said that, there is a tradition in Russian history that everything is the same until suddenly it all falls apart. So, we'll see. I don't have a good answer to that question. So Syria, again, I'm guessing there are probably people here who know more about this than me. I think as in all these cases, I think there's a Russian. I should have answered this when you asked about Mexico. Actually, I was thinking about Mexico. I was thinking about Latin America, but there is clearly a Russian strategy in the Middle East. Maybe not one as carefully worked out as the European strategy. Part of the Russian strategy is about making Russia a presence there again and giving Russia a role in deciding what happens. Occasionally you hear these hints from Russian officials about some kind of Yalta agreement, redrawing the borders, whatever that's going to look like, and making sure that Russia has a seat at that table in the Middle East. So I think that's part of. I think there's a domestic political reason why Russia's involved in Syria in particular, which is the Ukraine narrative began to go bad at a certain point when they weren't winning in eastern Ukraine, and it was clear that the idea of dividing Ukraine had failed. And actually, the war in Ukraine is not that popular in Russia. The Russians don't hate the Ukrainians as a general rule, and there's tons of intermarriage, and these are profoundly connected countries that have been, part of the same empires and, fought on the same sides in lots of wars for many years, and it wasn't going that well. And the Syria invasion, Russia's entry into the Syrian conflict happened right at that moment. It was a change of narrative. Look, we're fighting the jihadis. We've made Russia great again, and we're on this other stage. It's been a useful narrative for Putin to have this, this other conflict that he's winning. I think that's the second reason. The third reason, I think there is I hear, again, you may have a better sense of this than me. There is an argument that they feel some genuine link to the Assad regime because they've been supporting it for many years, and they've got bases there and so on. So you could say there's a piece of genuine strategy there. I really don't know how true that is. And there's a fourth thing, which is that after the fall of Gaddafi, Putin, who does think in terms of global narratives, was worried about the fate of dictatorships. And again, he's almost said this on a number of occasions, as have other Russian officials. And the need to prevent a dictator from falling. This sight of falling dictators. Again, this is his domestic political concern. He doesn't want. The idea that there could be a people's revolution that could overthrow the dictator and establish democracy. This is a bad idea for him. He would like to make sure that that's not so, and that can never happen. And I think Syria was a case where, again, he intervened in the Syria. Another reason for the timing of it was at a moment, if you'll remember, when it looked like Assad really might lose. And so it was an attempt to prevent Assad from losing and have those bad pictures of the dictator falling and being replaced by, I don't know whether even a different kind of government taking place. So I think you can look at all those reasons. I should add that the Russian disinformation campaign in Syria is remarkably similar in a lot of ways to the Russian disinformation campaign in Ukraine. I don't know that if there's this, I know there's lots of comparative politics courses. I don't know if anybody's ever done comparative disinformation campaigns, but it's a very interesting one. So the way the Ukraine one worked was by polarizing the conflict. It's the Nazis against the good guys. There was no nuance in Ukrainian politics, and the Syrian narrative has been the same. There's, on the one side, there's Assad, and on the other side are the jihadis, and we're fighting. And everybody who's against Assad is a jihadi. So it's this creation of a profoundly polarized narrative, and in which nuance is destroyed, and there are only two sides, and whoever's the group in the middle is eliminated from the conversation. That's part of what they've done there, which is again very similar to Ukraine. And just as an aside, lots of scientific studies have shown that polarization is very highly polarized audiences are much more susceptible to believing false stories than otherwise. So it's an interesting. And the other, some of the tools and technologies that have been used in Syria are also very similar to what's been done in Ukraine. The most remarkable one again, I'm guessing you all know this too, but I'll just mention it as a reminder, is the extraordinary campaign that's been conducted against the white helmets. I actually I look at it periodically, and it changes because these algorithms change over time. If you, on the YouTube page, if you put white helmets into the little search box, on a day, a couple of weeks ago, I did this, and I got, results 1, 2, 3, and 4 were from RT, and they were attacks on the white helmets done by Russian television. I think number 5 was a link to a Netflix show about the white helmets, and then numbers kind of 6, 7. One of them was Al Jazeera, and then other than that, kind of 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 of the first 10 results were also RT. So the attempt to flood the YouTube algorithm with video about a humanitarian organization, which literally these are people who rescue children from the rubble, is a really extraordinary, and I think has been probably also a very successful disinformation campaign. You tell me how well it works in Syria, but it's the same techniques and the same technology that have been tried in Ukraine are being used there as well. So I think seeing Syria, because of its prominence on Russian television, because of its prominence in the domestic narrative, is also clearly something that's very important for Putin.
Sir.
Hello, Christian Kafazov, LSE alumni. It's great to see you again.
I'm an LSE alumni too.
Yes, I remember when you taught about 4 years ago. This was at 2014, and your message was considered not as relevant as it is today. So, I have a question. It's in 2 parts. One is, how do you consider the recent NATO reaction against what happened in Britain as a loss for Putin, considering, especially since the former spy is still alive and the diplomatic reaction has kind of unified Europe more? Mm-hmm. And how does the Russian propaganda address this reaction by basically Russians not being able to invest in London as much as, or at least that being scrutinized? And the other question I was wondering is, to what extent does Putin also consider a propaganda victory the disinformation campaign against the United States in the 2016 election? So I was wondering what your thoughts are on those 2 issues. Mm-hmm.
So the reaction to the poisoning of Skripal is a very interesting one, because this, I think, was, and I know this was, that the British Foreign Office immediately understood as soon as that happened. First of all, they immediately understood what it was because they knew who he was as soon as he was picked up by an ambulance. But they also immediately anticipated that there would be a disinformation campaign around it. And one of the points I should have made is that not all responses to disinformation are information campaigns. Like, it's not necessarily that, that you respond to a lie with a fact check. That's not necessarily the correct answer. And sometimes the answer is in a different sphere. And so one of the first things the British said is that we're going to need a kind of allied response to this. We need a real to demonstrate in real life, not just in a newspaper article or in a social media campaign, that we all know what happened and that the knowledge is shared by a number of British governments, and that it's and that we're that we're reacting as a group. And so it was very important to the British from the beginning to get buy-in from other governments, and the way they did what they had some intelligence about how the operation, this is not a secret because they've now said this, they had some intelligence about how the operation was done, and literally that day or the next day they took it to Paris and I was about to say Bonn. That sounds old. I am. Anyway, they took it to Paris and Berlin and Washington, and they, and they immediately said, we know what's happened. We know what was used, and we know how it was done, and will you support us on this? And they immediately tried to build. So in other words, their response to the event was immediately a kind of alliance building exercise. They also, I don't know that they knew this would happen, but once they saw it, they understood it. So one of the things that people have learned, one of the ways we now know that Russians react to an event that they want to deny or distance themselves from is they produce millions of narratives. So the famous one now is when the MH17, when the Malaysian plane crashed in eastern Ukraine, the Russian response was not just to say, no, we didn't do it, but to produce like 5,000 different narratives about who might have done it, ranging from plausible to implausible to, a plane took off from Amsterdam and it already contained dead bodies and it was exploded deliberately over eastern Ukraine in order to, smear Putin. Literally, that was one of the things that was put out. And so, this Skripal thing has been very similar. There have been, the British did it, the Dutch did it, the Czechs did it, Skripal did it to himself. It was suicide. It was, the British Secret Services who were trying to discredit it. So that this process of putting out thousands of narratives was something that happened right away. And one of the ways the British dealt with that was actually, it was quite funny. They made a little video showing the different narratives, and they also had this. The Foreign Office had it created a. To people who write about this subject, they produce these emails where every day they would say, well, yesterday it was 17 narratives, now we're up to 19. And they would list the various narratives and pass them out to people and so on. So they again anticipated this is what the reaction would look like, and they produced responses to it. Was it, so I think it was successful in that most people, both in Britain and in Europe, believed the British government version of the story. In the end of the day, that's what it's about, is do you believe the British government or do you believe somebody else? But the numbers who didn't believe it are still pretty surprisingly high. I saw a poll, and I don't know how good a poll it was, that showed something like 70% of Europeans believe the British government and 30% don't. And the person who showed me this poll was somebody in the British government, and he was very cheered by this. He was like, look, we won this argument. And I thought, my God, 30%, that's very high. And again, the places in which the counter, oh, maybe it was the British who did it, worked was again very often on the extreme left, both in Britain or the extreme right. So we're still learning how to cope with it. I think the British feel so far that it was a successful, that they pushed back and they created some, real arguments and so on. But I think the jury is still out on what happens next. So 2016, I don't have any access to the deep thinking of people in the Kremlin about whether this was a success or a failure. I mean, in that merely the use of those tactics and the fact that they became part of the discussion about the U.S. election, regardless of the result, I think they would see that as having been a success. Look, we proved that there are things you can do to manipulate U.S. democracy. And I think that was, so in that sense, it was a success. Whether they like the outcome or not, I mean, I don't know. You can hear different versions of that from different people.
So we're going to take last two questions here, one here and one there, right? If you take them both at the same time, Anne, that's okay with you?
Yeah, and then let's...
Yeah. Mirko Kunz, I'm a former Fulbright scholar from Kyrgyzstan. So my question is, both are very short, and I know that for the first one, there is no simple answer. But is there anything that could stop Putin or make him to step back with all his strategic endeavors? And my second one, I like the point when you said on that we need to work with media that are able to be independent, although it's almost impossible to be independent in Russia. But how to help them to stay independent longer than they normally do, and also gain popularity, especially in post-Soviet republics, where we know that historic bonds are so strong that a majority do not even believe to anything more what I guess Putin's Kremlin dictates. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. Good questions. Right here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Crispin Clark. I'm from a new peace initiative out of the San Francisco tech and VC community that's yet to be launched. My question is just around more novel methods maybe we haven't heard about on countering the misinformation. I'm particularly interested in the NGO approach and then reaching directly the Russian people.
So the reaching directly the Russian people and the question about, the previous question about supporting independent media and making it work better are actually related. Mm-hmm. So the question is, I mean, you could almost think of this as sort of reverse engineering this, the polarization. I mean, I guess one of the problems with this subject is very quickly you get from what is Russia doing in this foreign policy problem to much more fundamental problems about politics and how you reach people and the ways in which social media has created these divided audiences. And so I would argue for a major research program to better understand Russian audiences and Kyrgyz audiences and Kazakh audiences. We really don't know that much about them. I was involved in a very small project that looks at that did some audience analysis on the Russian internet, and it's actually very interesting. There are many different kinds of views. I mean, we tend to think about, liberals versus pro-Putin people. Actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. There are different groups. It may be that we need different messages for different groups. And just telling people democracy is good and Putin is bad is maybe not the way to reach people. And many of the cruder techniques from Cold War era aren't going to work in our era. And remember that the U.S., in the 1970s and the 1980s there was a whole arsenal of arguments that we had actually. And the arguments were, blue jeans, abstract art, pop music, prosperity, and sort of 5 other things plus democracy. And some of those things just don't work anymore. I mean, there's plenty of pop music in Russia. I mean, and there's plenty of abstract art. So some of the arguments aren't as we don't have the cultural power that they once did. But more understanding of Russian audiences, more work with media in those countries and in other countries, trying to do the same. I mean, I keep thinking, is there a way to, okay, so we now have these fragmented audiences. Is there a way to reverse engineer that? Are there ways we can reinvent journalism to breach polarized divides? Are there ways of writing to get better, to convince people to read better information? I don't really have any good answers to that I can give you right now, but I would like to see American universities and European universities, and it's not really a question of government funding, although there does need to be more funding for more research into that. How do we reach people? How do we understand these audiences? What does the Kyrgyz internet look like? Who are the people likely to want to read? I don't know, pro-American, even pro-American messaging, so that we get through this. This really hateful language about the United States. We've only begun to look at how to do that. We've been very slow and lax about trying to understand how these issues work in other countries. And I think I keep saying the Russians, but I'm sure there are plenty of other. Whereas understanding our own society has been something that's been very easy for others to do. So we're very divided. Others are divided as well. Having a much deeper research base was kind of the beginning of the answer to some of these questions. And sorry, that's not very satisfying. But.
It's very satisfying. And let me thank you on behalf of the crew here. You have helped us understand the problem. You've given us ideas about what can be done. We're close to the folks across the street. We have a couple of representatives from across the street. And we will be using this kind of ideas. You've made the point a couple times, the Russians are pretty good at this. They've been doing it longer than we have. It's not hard. That is, people anywhere can do it. Mm-hmm. And it's not inevitable that we win this one. There's a lot of work that we need to do, and you've helped us do that. So please join me in thanking Ann Applebaum.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.